Every night, when the wind passed through the forest at the edge of Abosi village, the trees spoke. Not in whispers. Not in the quiet rustling of leaves that people easily mistake for the evening breeze. They spoke in clear, human voices. Deep voices. Old voices. Voices that carried the weight of things buried a very long time ago. But in all of Abosi village, with its farmers and fishermen, its market women and its elders, its crowds of children who ran barefoot through the red dust, only one person could hear them. A 12-year-old boy named Kofi. And the trees were not telling stories to pass the night. They were not sharing memories from the old days or singing the soft songs that the forest sometimes made when rain was coming. They were warning him. Night after night, the voices drifted out of the darkness and found Kofi wherever he was. They found him on his sleeping mat when the whole village was quiet. They found him at the river in the early morning. They found him among the goats he grazed every afternoon, standing completely still while the animals moved around him, his eyes fixed on the line of trees at the edge of the world. The words were scattered at first. Broken. Like something being shouted from very far away. But they were growing closer. And whatever the trees were trying to say, Kofi could feel it in his bones. It was not good. Abosi village sat on flat land between a slow river and a wide, ancient forest. The river gave the village water and fish. The farmland between the river and the village gave it food. And the forest, tall, thick, and dark, stood at the northern edge of everything, watching. The elders of Abosi called it the Forest of Ancestors. They said it was older than the village itself. Older than the roads, older than the market, older than the first fire that was ever lit beneath a cooking pot in that valley. They said the spirits of the first people, the ones who had built Abosi with bare hands and strong backs, had passed into the trees when they died. That the forest breathed with the breath of those long gone. Because of this belief, the elders had two rules that no one was allowed to break. No tree in the Forest of Ancestors could be cut without the blessing of the chief and the elders together. And no person was to enter the forest after sunset. These two rules had kept peace in Abosi for as long as anyone could remember. But over the years, as new generations grew up and the old stories faded into the background of ordinary life, many villagers had quietly stopped believing in the forest's power. To the younger men, it was simply unused land. Dark trees. Thick roots. Nothing more. To Kofi, it had always been something else entirely. He just had not known what, until now. Kofi was not like the other children of Abosi. While boys his age gathered at the riverbank to wrestle and shout and splash water at each other after school, Kofi preferred to sit near the edge of the Forest of Ancestors with his goats, listening. He was not shy, exactly. He could speak when he needed to. He could answer questions in class and help customers at his mother's stall without difficulty. But he rarely started conversations on his own, and he rarely laughed loudly, and most of the time, he was content to simply watch and listen to the world around him. The other children thought this was strange. They called him names. Tree boy. Goat boy. Kofi, who talks to leaves. He did not fight back. He did not cry. He simply turned away and went back to his goats and the forest edge, where things felt more honest to him than they did in the noise of the village. His mother worried. She told him he needed friends his own age. She told him the forest was no place for a growing boy to be spending his afternoons. She had heard the old stories from her own mother, and even if she did not believe all of them, something in her went uneasy whenever she saw her son standing so close to the tree line, perfectly still, his head tilted slightly to one side, as though listening to something she could not hear. She was right that he was listening. She just did not yet know to what. The only person in the village who truly understood Kofi was his grandmother. Her name was Nana Efua. She was old and small, with hands that felt like dry bark when she held yours and eyes that never seemed to miss anything. She had outlived her husband, and 2 of her children, and the people of Obosi said she had survived so long because the earth itself was simply not ready to take her back. Nana Efua never told Kofi to stop going near the forest. When his mother scolded him for standing too long at the tree line, Nana Efua would catch his eye from across the compound and give him one slow, quiet nod. As if she understood something the others did not. One evening, when Kofi was about 8 years old, she called him to sit beside her outside their house while the sun was going down behind the trees. She held his hand in both of hers and looked at his face for a long moment before she spoke. "Kofi," she said, "most people walk through this world making so much noise that they cannot hear what is all around them. The wind speaks. The earth speaks. Even the trees speak. But only a quiet person will ever hear them." She looked toward the darkening forest visible beyond the village rooftops. "If you ever listen carefully enough," she said, "the earth will always tell you the truth." Kofi was 8 years old when she said that. He was 12 when he finally understood what she meant. The evening it began was ordinary in every way. The sun was sliding down behind the trees, painting the sky orange and then deep red. The air smelled of cooking smoke and damp earth. Kofi was walking his goats back along the path that ran close to the forest edge, the same path he had walked every evening for years. He was thinking about nothing in particular. Then the wind moved through the trees. But the sound that came back was not the sound of wind moving through leaves. Kofi stopped walking. The goats continued for a few steps and then stopped too, bunching close together the way animals do when something makes them uneasy. The sound came again. Low. Deep. Slow. Like a voice speaking from inside a very large chest somewhere inside the darkness of the trees. "The roots are trembling." Kofi did not breathe. He had heard strange things near the forest before, bird calls he could not identify, deep creakings in the dark that made him hurry home. But this was different. This was not a sound he could explain away with common sense. This was a voice. A clear, slow, unmistakable human voice, coming from somewhere among the trees. He turned his head slightly toward the oldest section of the forest. Another voice came then, different from the first. Higher. Rougher. Almost angry. "They are coming with iron." And then a third, barely above a whisper. "The forest will bleed." Kofi ran. He ran so fast that 2 of the goats were left behind on the path. He did not stop to count them. He did not slow down at all until he was inside the compound, breathing so hard that his chest ached and his legs were shaking beneath him. His mother looked up from the cooking pot. "Kofi? What happened to you? Where are the goats?" He could not speak yet. He put his hands on his knees and bent forward. "Kofi. Look at me. What happened?" He sat down on the ground and pressed his palms flat against the earth until his hands steadied. "I heard voices," he said finally. "From inside the forest." His mother stared at him. "What do you mean, voices?" "In the trees. Real voices. 3 different ones, speaking clearly." She set her spoon down slowly. "Kofi, you have been spending too much time out there alone. Your mind is." "They said the roots are trembling," he said quietly. "They said something is coming with iron. They said the forest will bleed." His mother was still for a moment. Then she said in a firm, quiet voice, "You are not to go near the forest path again. Take the long route for the goats from now on." She went back to her pot. That night, lying on his mat, Kofi stared at the ceiling in the dark. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again. And the voices returned, clearer than before. He pulled his cloth over his head and lay completely still, listening to every word. Over the days that followed, the voices did not stop. Each time Kofi passed near the forest, even along the longer route his mother had told him to use, the trees found him. As if distance no longer meant anything. As if they had decided he was the one they were speaking to, and that was final. He began to notice that different trees had different voices. Some sounded old and deeply tired, as though they had been holding something heavy for centuries and their strength was finally giving out. Some sounded angry, a low grinding sound like wood about to crack under enormous pressure. And some simply sounded afraid. That last kind was the hardest to hear. There is something deeply unsettling about hearing fear in something you have always believed to be unbreakable. The warnings came in pieces, and he tried to hold them together like fragments of a broken clay pot. Strangers were approaching. That was clear. The forest was in danger. Also clear. And beneath the forest. Beneath the roots, beneath deep soil that no human hand had touched in generations, something had been buried. Something that must never, under any condition, be disturbed. But no matter how carefully he listened, the trees would not tell him what that thing was. It was as if saying it aloud, even in warning, was far too dangerous. Kofi began writing the pieces down in his school notebook so he would not lose a single word. He did not know yet how much he was going to need every one of them. On the 5th day, Kofi decided he could no longer carry the warnings alone. He went to the village square after morning prayers, when the older men sat outside the chief's compound to drink tea and talk about the day ahead. He waited for a pause in the conversation, then stepped forward into the open. "Please," he said. "I need everyone to hear something." The men looked at him. He told them everything. The voices. The different tones he had learned to recognize. The 3 warnings from the first evening. The fragments that had come in the days since, the strangers approaching, the forest in danger, the buried thing beneath the roots that must never be touched. When he finished, the square was quiet for a moment. Then someone laughed. Then another person laughed. Then 3 or 4 men were chuckling at once, and someone said, "The boy has been eating too much of that forest air," and someone else said, "Send him to school more and to the trees less," and the laughter spread easily across the small gathering. Kofi stood still and let it pass. Then Odikro Mensa, the chief of Abosi, held up one hand for quiet. He looked at Kofi without warmth. "You are a good boy," he said carefully. "But spreading fear in this village with foolish stories is not something I will allow. Go home. Help your mother. Leave the forest business to the grown men." Kofi walked home without another word. Not a single adult had taken him seriously. Except one. Nana Efua was sitting outside grinding pepper when Kofi came back through the gate. She looked at his face and set the grinding stone down immediately. "Come," she said. He sat beside her on the low wooden bench. He told her what had happened at the square, the laughter, the chief's words, the way the men had turned back to their tea before he had even reached the compound gate on his way out. He told her he was beginning to wonder if he was wrong after all, if his mother had been right from the beginning, if some part of his mind had simply been inventing things from too many afternoons alone at the tree line. Nana Efua listened without interrupting once. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked him one question. "The voices in the trees," she said carefully. "When they spoke to you, did they sound afraid?" Kofi thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "Some of them did." Something crossed Nana Efua's face then. It was not fear exactly. It was the look of a person who has been quietly dreading a particular moment for a very long time and has just watched it finally arrive. She turned to look at the forest, visible beyond the last row of houses at the far edge of the village. Her face went pale beneath the deep brown of her skin. She sat like that for nearly a full minute, staring at the tree line and saying nothing. Then she stood up. "Come inside," she said softly. "Close the door." Her voice had changed. The steadiness was still there, but underneath it was something Kofi had never heard from her before. She was afraid, too. Inside the house, with the door shut and evening light falling through the single small window, Nana Efua sat across from Kofi and folded her hands in her lap. "What I am about to tell you," she said, "has not been spoken aloud in this village for many, many years. The people who remembered it are almost all gone. I am one of the last." Kofi said nothing. He waited. She told him that long before Obosi had become what it was today, the first people of that valley had made a sacred agreement with the forest of ancestors. The forest would protect the land. It would bring rain in the dry season. It would hold the soil together and keep the river from flooding the farms. It would stand as a living boundary between the village and whatever lay beyond. In return, the people of Obosi had to honor two promises forever. They would never cut the trees without the blessing of the ancestors. And they would never dig in the heart of the forest. Not for any reason. Not for treasure. Not for farmland. Not for anything the living world could offer. Kofi frowned. Why not dig? Nana Efua looked at him directly. Because beneath the heart of the forest, she said slowly, something was buried. Something ancient. Something the first people of Obosi spent everything they had to seal away and keep from the world. What was it? Kofi asked. His grandmother was quiet for a long moment. Something, she said finally, that should never be woken up. The pepper grinder sat forgotten outside in the growing dark. 3 days later, strangers arrived in Obosi. There were 5 of them. They came in 2 large trucks that raised a long cloud of red dust along the village road. They were well dressed, with clean pressed shirts and smooth leather shoes, and they carried folders full of papers and small handheld devices that beeped and clicked when pointed at the ground. They set up a folding table under the shade of the big neem tree in the village square and asked the people of Obosi to come and listen. Their leader was a round-faced man named Mr. Donkor. He had a wide, easy smile and the relaxed confidence of someone who had made this same presentation in many villages before this one and always received a good reception. He told the gathered villagers that his company had conducted surveys of the entire area. Beneath the forest of ancestors, he said, lay one of the richest deposits of minerals in the whole region. Gold. Bauxite. Things the earth had been holding for thousands of years, just waiting for the right people to find them. He explained what this discovery would mean for Obosi. Jobs. Real, paid positions for the men of the village. Roads. Proper roads connecting Obosi directly to the city. Schools. A clinic. Infrastructure built at the company's cost. Every family in the village would benefit. He smiled broadly as he described it all, as though he was personally delivering the best news Obosi had ever received. To most of the people standing in the square that afternoon, perhaps he was. The arguments that followed lasted 3 full days. The older men and the few remaining elders who still carried the old stories argued against the plan. The forest of ancestors was sacred. The agreement had held for generations. To break it now, for money, would invite consequences that no road or clinic could undo. But the younger men argued back, and many of the mothers with children argued with them. What had the old agreement truly ever given them? Rain came and went regardless of the forest. Floods happened anyway. Children grew up, left for the city, and never came back because there was nothing in Obosi worth staying for. There was no clinic, no good road, nothing. Here was a company offering to change all of that. Why should old stories stand in the way of the living? Kofi sat at the edges of every meeting, his notebook pressed against his chest. He tried to speak twice. Both times, he was waved away before he could finish a sentence. On the 3rd evening, Odikro Mensa stood before the gathered village and gave his decision. He had weighed the matter carefully. He had spoken with the company representatives at length. He had thought about his duty to Obosi and his responsibility to the living, not only to the long dead. The company would be permitted to begin exploration inside the Forest of Ancestors. Work will start in 1 week. That night, Kofi could not sleep. Because that night, for the first time, the trees did not whisper. They screamed. Kofi pressed both hands over his ears. It made no difference. The voices were not coming through his ears. They were coming through something deeper, some part of him that had been quietly connected to the forest his whole life without his ever fully understanding it. He lay on his mat in the dark and let the noise wash over him, catching words and phrases the way a fisherman catches pieces of broken wood in a flooded river. They do not understand what they are doing. Stop them. You must stop them. If the roots are broken, the prison opens. That last one landed like a stone in still water. Prison. He had not heard that word before. He grabbed his notebook from beneath the mat and wrote it down with shaking hands, along with everything else he could capture before it passed. Then, cutting through the noise of all the others, the deepest voice came. The one he heard least often. The one that seemed to rise from the ground itself rather than from any individual tree. The one that carried the kind of age that makes all other voices sound young by comparison. It said, "If the roots are broken, the sleeping one will wake." Kofi sat upright in the dark. He understood now that this was not a warning that could wait for adults to listen. He was going to have to find the truth himself. And there was only one place in the world where that truth was kept. He left the house 2 hours before dawn. The village was completely still. Not even the dogs were moving. Kofi slipped between the compounds in bare feet, keeping to the shadows at the edges of the paths, his breathing slow and deliberate. He reached the tree line. He stopped there for a long moment and looked into the darkness between the trunks. In all his years of listening to the forest from a distance, he had never once entered it after sunset. That rule had lived deep inside him since childhood, the way certain fears do, not because of anything specific, but because every adult around you has always treated the thing as simply and completely forbidden. But the voices had changed tonight. They were no longer warning or crying out in desperation. They had become something softer. More like A.H. And placed gently on the shoulder. More like a guide. He stepped in. The forest swallowed the moonlight almost immediately. The canopy above was so thick and high that the darkness inside was nearly complete. But Kofi found, strangely, that he could feel the path more than he could see it. His feet moved with a confidence his eyes could not account for. The voices guided him. A low murmur to his left. A soft tone ahead. A barely there sound that said no, not that way, come this way. He walked deeper than he had ever gone in daylight. Then he stepped through a gap between 2 enormous trunks into a clearing. And he saw it. The oldest tree in the Forest of Ancestors stood in a clearing where nothing else grew nearby. Its trunk was so wide that if Kofi had stretched both arms outward in opposite directions, he could not have reached even halfway around it. Its roots rose out of the earth like the backs of sleeping animals, massive and ancient, spreading out from the base in every direction, some as thick as a grown man's body. It was the largest living thing he had ever seen. He stood before it in the dark and did not speak. He simply looked. Then the tree spoke. The voice was unlike the others he had heard. It was not angry or exhausted or afraid. It was simply old. Older than anything Kofi had a word for. And it was calm, the way very old things sometimes become calm because they have already witnessed everything the world is capable of doing and are no longer surprised by any of it. "You came," it said. "Yes," Kofi whispered. "Then listen carefully. There is not much time." The tree told him what Nana Efua had not fully known. Long before Obosi was built, the land had been struck by something older than any story the village still carried. Not a flood or a fire. Something else. A spirit born from the hunger deep inside the earth, a thing that swallowed rivers, cracked open ground, and left silence behind it where villages once stood. The first ancestors could not destroy it. But they could contain it. They buried it deep beneath this clearing and planted the forest above it as a living seal. Every root was a lock. Every tree was a wall. Kofi ran home as the sky began to lighten in the east. He went straight to Nana Efua's room and shook her gently awake. He sat on the edge of her mat and told her everything the old tree had said. She sat up slowly, her face grave in the half-darkness, and she listened without moving. When he finished, she reached out and held his face in both her dry hands for a long moment. "You must tell the village," she said. "They will not listen to me. Tell them anyway. You are the only one who knows." That morning, Kofi went to the village square. This time, he did not wait politely for a pause. He walked to the center and spoke in a loud, clear voice and said he needed everyone to hear him. A few people stopped. Most did not. He told them about the night in the forest. The oldest tree. The spirit is buried beneath the roots. The living prison that had been holding it in silence for centuries. He told them that every tree felled was a lock broken and every hole dug was a wall torn down. This time, there was no laughter. There was something worse. Silence, followed by the slow return to ordinary conversation, as though he had said nothing at all. Only a few faces showed any unease. Among them was an old woman named May Mama, a lifelong friend of Nana Efua, who clutched her wrapper tightly and stared at the tree line with haunted eyes. But she said nothing either. That afternoon, the miners arrived with their machines and their axes. And they began. The sound of axes striking trees rang out across Abosi in sharp, rhythmic blows that carried far in the still afternoon air. Then the machines started. A low, grinding roar that seemed to travel not just through the air but through the ground itself, vibrating up through the soles of Kofi's feet as he stood at the edge of the village and stared toward the forest. He ran. The miners had started at the outer edge of the forest, as agreed. They were not yet near the heart of it. But the outer trees were old too, and their roots ran deep and intertwined with everything farther in. Kofi pushed past a worker and screamed at the men with axes to stop. A miner put one heavy hand on his shoulder and moved him aside without breaking his rhythm. Kofi found Odikro Mensa standing with two company men, watching the work proceed. "Chief. Please. You have to stop them right now. You do not understand what is under there." Odikro Mensa looked at him for a long moment. "Boy. Go home." Kofi stood at the edge of the cleared ground with his fists at his sides, watching the trees fall. Then something changed. The wind stopped. Completely and instantly, as if it had been cut with a knife. The leaves hung motionless. The grasses stood perfectly upright. Even the sound of insects disappeared. The miners slowed. Several of them looked around, expressions shifting into something between confusion and unease. Then the ground moved. It was not a large movement. Not enough to knock anyone off their feet or crack the walls of a house. But it was unmistakable and deep, a slow trembling beneath the surface that came from far below, as though something vast had shifted its weight in its sleep. Then the cracks appeared. Thin at first, like lines drawn in the dirt by a slow, careful finger. Then spreading outward quickly from the forest edge, branching and widening as they ran across the cleared ground. From the largest cracks, dark smoke began to rise. Not fire smoke. Something thicker and colder, moving in slow curls, carrying the smell of deep earth and sealed places and things that had not touched open air in a very long time. The miners dropped their tools and started shouting. Kofi did not waste the moment. He turned and ran into the village, going from compound to compound, door to door, pulling at sleeves and arms, calling out in a voice he had never used before. Not the quiet, patient voice he used when people dismissed him, but something louder and more urgent and harder to ignore. Come now. Bring shovels. Bring young trees from the school nursery. Bring anything that can fill a hole and plant a root. Come right now. Some people ignored him. But some came. Nana Efua appeared, moving faster than her age should have allowed. May Mama came, gripping a garden tool. 3 farmers came at a run. And then some of the young men who had laughed at him in the square came too, because the sound drifting from the direction of the forest now was something none of them had a word for. A deep, slow moan, rising steadily from below the earth. They worked through the night. Kofi led them along the path into the forest, following the same route he had walked alone in the dark just 2 nights before. The ground trembled faintly beneath every step. The dark smoke had thickened around the oldest trees, rising in slow columns between the roots, and the cracks near the heart of the forest were wider and deeper than the ones at the edge. In the clearing around the oldest tree, the air itself felt different. Heavier. Charged, the way the sky feels before a very bad storm. The oldest tree said nothing. It did not need to. Kofi already knew what had to be done. The miners had fled when the shaking started, leaving their tools and machines behind. Kofi's group used those tools without hesitation. They filled the pits that the machines had opened, shoveling earth back into the torn ground as fast as tired arms could manage. They carried young saplings from the school nursery, pressing their small roots into the refilled soil with careful, urgent hands. At the boundary of the sacred clearing, Nana Efua walked slowly in a wide circle, her lips moving in a low, steady murmur. She was not speaking to anyone around her. The words she used were old, older than Abosi, older than the stories Kofi knew, and she spoke them to the ground itself. Gradually, the trembling eased. The dark smoke began to thin and dissolve. The cracks narrowed slowly, one by one, pressing back together as if drawn by invisible hands from below. By the time the first gray light of dawn appeared above the canopy, the forest was still. And the shadow that had begun to rise never completed its ascent. The mining company left Abosi and did not return. In the weeks that followed, the village was quiet in a different way than before. Not the ordinary silence of people going about their daily lives, but the quieter quiet of people who have witnessed something they cannot fully explain and are still turning it over in their minds. Odikro Mensa called a public gathering. He did not make a long speech. He simply stood before the people of Abosi and said that the sacred rules of the Forest of Ancestors would be observed again, completely and without exception, from that day forward. No cutting without the blessing of the elders. No digging anywhere in the forest. The ancient agreement would be honored. He did not look directly at Kofi when he said this. He did not have to. Years passed, as they do. Kofi grew up. He became a teacher at the village school and later married and had children of his own. The Forest of Ancestors healed slowly, the way forests do when they are left in peace, putting out new growth each season, filling in the spaces that had been torn open until no scar remained. The trees never spoke to Kofi again. He had wondered, sometimes, whether he would miss it. He decided that he did not. Some gifts, he had come to understand, are given only as long as they are needed, and then quietly taken back. But some mornings, walking his children along the path to school, the path that ran close to the forest edge, one of them would stop without warning. They would go still. Their head would tilt slowly to one side. And they would look toward the tree line with eyes that saw something Kofi could not. "Papa," they would say, in a voice full of quiet wonder. "Did you hear that?" Kofi would look at the trees. He would look at his child. And he would smile.